Hello and welcome to episode 285 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. And Ian, you told me that there's a lot to talk about today before we started recording. Is that still the case?
I mean, I hope so. Otherwise,
Wow.
It kind of defeats the purpose of doing a podcast.
And here we thought it would be a quiet end of summer week.
Yeah,
Nope.
It wasn't. Isn't. It's only Wednesday. And some of the biggest news that we're talking about probably won't happen until early Friday morning, right before the podcast comes out. So we're going to talk about some things, and we're going to make some assumptions and some what ifs. And then next week, we'll come back and talk about whether we got it right or got it wrong. But we'll get to that a little bit later. All else being equal, would have been the top story this week, talking about Boeing and the IAM's tentative labor agreement and possible vote to accept the agreement or strike by the rank and file. But we go to Atlanta first, where the good folks taxiing aircraft in Atlanta, I believe the technical term for this, Jason, is a whoopsie-daisy.
I think you might find that in a couple handbooks, yeah.
Yeah, we'll check the ICAO library just to make sure. But thankfully, no one was injured when a Delta Airlines A350 struck an Endeavor Air operating as Delta Connection CRJ 900 in Atlanta on Tuesday morning. That collision with the right wingtip of the A350 striking the tail of the CRJ 900 resulted in the tail of the CRJ 900 falling off.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's different. The A350 wasn't taxiing at an abnormally high rate of speed.
12 knots?
12 knots,
So
not crazy.
slow.
Not Southwest speeds by any measure.
Not Southwest speeds.
But I guess the 350 just has so much more mass that the tail section of the CRJ just kind of noped out of the situation, which is surprising to me because this is not the first time, and probably not the last time, a CRJ will be assaulted by a wide-body aircraft. And the most famous case of this, I think, is from 2011, maybe, where the Air France A380 rammed a Com Air, also operating as Delta Connection, CRJ 700 back in the day, and flung the CRJ. I think it rotated like 90 degrees.
It spun it right around.
It spun it, but the tail didn't fall off. In this case, kind of the exact opposite. The CRJ held its ground, didn't really move, but the whole tail assembly
just popped right off.
Broke off.
Just popped right off. Just fell right over.
Yeah. Okay. I think it was an 11-year-old CRJ 900, so not the oldest out there, not the newest by far, but they ain't making any more of these. So I do wonder if Delta's going to fix this, and we've seen them fix a great number of very interesting looking things in the past, but the entire tail assembly of a CRJ.
You get to a point of diminishing returns. And I made this joke yesterday on the Twitters about, if anyone can fix it, it's Delta Tech Ops. But also, while Mitsubishi Heavy Industries does offer OEM support for the CRJ series, I don't know if they offer quite that much support. Plus, you got to think that with the tail completely off, there's internal damage that's just
I'm sure
pretty bad as well.
Almost certainly some structural damage to the airframe as well, more than we can just see from the tail, because that's quite a bit of forces to completely dislodge it. But thankfully, Delta Tech Ops is just a taxi on down the taxiway, and they
just tow it over.
They do service pretty much anything up to and including both the CRJ and the A350 that caused the incident here. Or we shouldn't say caused the incident, because we don't know who's to blame here or if any one party is to blame. Because, Ian, you told me that there's some interesting circumstances that led to both of these aircraft being in that position.
Right. So what happened is the CRJ was taxiing for departure on Atlanta's runway 8 right, which is on the north side of the airfield. It's part of the North Runway Complex. And they had taxied taxiway Echo, which is parallel to runway 08 right. And then they had taken a right turn on Hotel, which is basically the full length taxiway 295, which was the A350, was also on echo behind the CRJ. And they had told air traffic control that they needed a moment to work a problem. They weren't specific over the radio of what that problem was. They asked if they could hold on echo. Ground controller said, no, keep going. Echo short of Victor. I need to basically get you out of the way of the departing aircraft, and then we can swing you back around. It looks like the CRJ did not pull all the way up to the stop bars before runway 8 right. And the A350, being rather largely wingspanned, clipped that tail. Interestingly enough, and this was Ben Barrett, who's an Atlanta native and has spent a lot of time following aircraft at Atlanta, brought up the fact that the A350 was on the north side of the airfield because of closures on the southern runway complex. So this aircraft would normally depart from the southern runways, departing from the northern runway yesterday because of those runway closures. So that aircraft normally isn't there. So it seems like there's a bunch of different factors playing into this. Lots of questions about where the aircraft were exactly, and the NTSB, which is investigating, I'm sure will sort all of that out to figure out how we can be better about driving airplanes around the airfield.
Yeah, every time there's an incident like this on the ground, I'm always just kind of amazed that your base model car still has sensors all over to tell you if you're going to back up into the garage or a pole or a tree or whatever, but aircraft still, they don't have anything. They will let you taxi into a brick wall and not tell you you're going to do that. It's just kind of one of those things that you would think every time these happen that maybe Honeywell will come up with some sort of sonar radar-based thing in the wing so they could provide a warning to pilots to say, hey, stop it. You don't have the wing clearance you think you have here. But nope, still not a thing.
I mean, and the question has been asked, at least of me a few times in the past day, don't they have cameras? They do, but the cameras on the A350 don't cover the wingtips. The forward-facing camera on the rear of the aircraft, mounted in the vertical stabilizer, does not cover all the way to the wingtips, which you think you could put two cameras in there and make one wide angle, and there you go. But who knows, if that would have actually solved the issue here, because they were working a problem. Maybe the first officer was head down trying to resolve the problem, and that's what they were working on, or, who knows what was going on. Thankfully, Jason, we have, hopefully, I think, the cockpit voice recorder, because it wasn't overwritten this time. They
didn't get too far.
So hopefully that shed some light on what was happening on the flight deck of the A350, and then the flight data recorders give us the precise location of where they were relative to the stop bar. Because remember, the positions that we get via ADS-B are super helpful, but they're also where the GPS antenna is on the aircraft, which is usually the forward fuselage and not necessarily taking into account how far back the aircraft stretches from where that GPS position's being taken. So yeah, we'll wait for the NTSB's report to learn more on this, but very good to see that no one was injured other than the CRJ 900 and
very injured. But you can be sure I'm going to set an alert for that aircraft. So the next time
is it back?
I want to know what it's up to, because if you're a wagering person, I'd say it's probably going to fly again.
I mean, I will take that after we finish recording, whether or not there's a friendly wager involved in there, but we'll see. The preliminary report by Brazilian investigators on the VoePass ATR crash came out late last week, and it's in Portuguese only. So I did my best to use tools available, such as the fine machines in the computery box, to translate this. It makes sense to me based on, comparing the machine translation versus the text presented by the Brazilian investigators in Portuguese. So we're just a note as we discuss, this is machine translated.
But you're taking this so seriously that make the noise, Ian. Make the noise I picked up on earlier.
I printed it out.
He printed it out and highlighted. That's how you know we came prepared, because he used actual paper and a printer, which I get. You have a printer, which is interesting. But what did you print? What did you learn?
So the reason that I printed it is because there are two timelines within the report. And having paper was very helpful in jumping back and forth between the two and understanding kind of what the report is getting at. Because there's a timeline of events and of things that the aircraft is doing. And there's also a timeline of what the pilots and air traffic control were communicating to each other and why, which I thought was interesting. And we'll get to that in a moment. But starting with the kind of timeline, they walk us through what the aircraft was doing and what the aircraft systems were telling the pilots throughout the flight. So the aircraft takes off at 14:58:05 from the runway. It's in the air, and 14 minutes later, the pilots turn on the anti-icing. So you've got propeller anti-icing 1 and 2 were activated. Then a few minutes later, as soon as they cross flight level 130, which is where the SIGMET warned them the ice would be. So we're expecting ice at this point. There is an active SIGMET for icing. The electronic ice detector connected to the centralized crew alert system displays an alert. So they say, hey, there's icing. A few seconds later, they activate the airframe de-icing. So I'll stop here for a second. We talked about airframe de-icing in the context of the ATR when Steve Giordano was on in episode 281. So a few weeks ago, we talked about how the ATR and turboprops generally have de-icing and anti-icing. But just to recap, there's electronic anti-icing, which is basically surfaces on the aircraft are heated so that ice can't stick to them. And then there's de-icing surfaces, so places on the aircraft where you have, in the case of the ATR, pneumatic boots, which expand and break off any accumulated ice. So they turn on the airframe de-icing, and this is where we start to get, we get the first inkling that something could possibly go wrong with this flight. At 15:42, so about 17 minutes after they've taken to the air and after they've flown into icing conditions, a single chime alarm was heard in the cabin. The crew then commented about receiving a fault message on the airframe de-icing. Now, the preliminary report that the Brazilian investigators put out includes checklists for what to do in icing conditions and what to do if there are things like faults with the de-icing. If there is a de-icing fault, and again, we don't know exactly what this is, but the de-icing fault checklist for the ATR says if they are in icing conditions, the action is to leave and avoid and turn the de-icing of the airframe off. Well, that didn't happen.
I don't believe they ever left the de-icing scenario, did they?
No, they were in icing conditions for much of the rest of the flight, if not the whole flight. The electronic ice detector showed an alert. The alert stopped showing, then it showed again, then it stopped showing. So it goes on and off 6 times.
And that's something I wanted to point out. When we talked to Steve, I had mentioned that not all aircraft have the capability to tell pilots that, hey, there's a buildup of icing going on. This aircraft did, and it does seem to have been operating, at least to some degree, to tell the pilots, hey, there's icing building up on the wings or critical surfaces. So it wasn't just a situation where the pilots would have had to look out the window and observe it. This aircraft was telling the pilots, hey, there's ice buildup. You got to do something about it.
Right. So on the ATR, on this specific ATR, there are 2 pieces of technology. There's the ice evidence probe, which is a piece below the front left windscreen, which is designed to be the first thing to accumulate ice and the last thing to have no ice on it. And so you are to believe that you are in icing conditions if that probe has ice on it. There's also on the underside of the left wing an electronic ice detector, which is exactly what it says. It's electronic, it detects ice. So this is all happening. The electronic ice detector is displaying an alert. It's going off. It's coming on. And so they turn on and off the airframe de-icing. So then they're getting towards Sao Paulo. They start contacting Sao Paulo Approach, and they want to begin descending. And Sao Paulo Approach says, no, you need to stay up where you are at 17,000 feet. At 1841, with a speed of 191 knots, the cruise speed low alert was displayed. So again, they've helpfully included what to do, the checklist, what to do if you get the cruise speed low. If you're in icing conditions, you monitor it and you monitor the speed. Okay, that's fine. Nothing terrible yet. Then they say, can we descend? And Sao Paulo Approach says, no, you need to maintain your altitude at 17,000 so far, because there were two flights that were in conflict below them at 15,000 feet. So they were waiting to descend before those two flights were cleared. At 19:28, with a speed of 184 knots, the degraded performance alert is displayed. So we're talking about three stages of alerts. There's cruise speed low, degraded performance, and then increased speed. Those are in order of severity.
This is the aircraft putting every warning it can short of a stall warning, saying, hey, something's going on here. You need to take action.
Yes. Things are bad. Now? Things are bad.
You're not
and
stalling.
They could get worse if you don't do something. So the cruise speed low is a blue message. So, hey, be aware of this. You need to keep an eye on this. The degraded performance alert is an amber message with a master caution alert that indicates a significant performance degradation of around 22 to 28%, induced by a significant increase in aerodynamic drag. We, at this point, believe that that is icing, resulting in a drop in cruise indicated airspeed of around 15 to 20 knots, below the speed that's being computed by the aircraft performance monitoring tool. So what the aircraft thinks it should be cruising at. So that happens. What you're supposed to do when you get a degraded performance, and the checklist for that is maintain above the icing bug plus 10 knots. So there's a speed reference when in icing conditions that the pilots set. That's a base speed where the icing bug goes. It's a little bug on the speed dial, on the indicated airspeed dial. They manually enter. And for this flight, as discussed by the pilots and in the preliminary report, that's 165 knots. So the aircraft is saying you should be maintaining 165 plus 10. It is recommended to accelerate to 165 plus 30. Okay, so the checklist says, we think you should be at 195 knots or greater. Monitor your indicated airspeed and vertical speed and amend your flight path. That did not happen. They continued. This is where we get to the second in command mentioning, quote, a lot of ice. And then they activated the airframe de-icing for the third time. They were cleared to proceed directly to position Sanpa, maintaining flight level 170. And the ATC had said they would give them clearance to descend in 2 minutes. Crew confirmed that message, and that was the last time that air traffic control heard from the crew. They began a right turn at 16:20:50 towards Sampa. At 16:20:57, during that turn with a speed of 169 knots. So remember, we've gone down from 191 when the first cruise speed low was mentioned, 184 degraded performance. So now we're down to 169 knots indicated airspeed. The increased speed alert was displayed. So at the increased speed alert, you want to accelerate to the icing bug plus 30 knots, so 195 knots in this case, and go through the severe icing procedures. Unfortunately, 12 seconds after that increased speed alert was displayed, control of the aircraft was lost. The aircraft entered an abnormal flight attitude, rolling 52 degrees to the left, 94 degrees to the right, undergoing a heading change in a clockwise direction of 180 degrees, then reversing that heading change to a counterclockwise flat spin, spinning 5 times before impacting the ground. I printed this out because I was translating it paragraph by paragraph. And as I was reading it, in my mind, the crew had multiple opportunities to address what seemed to me to be very important warnings. As the preliminary report notes, the crew was well equipped with training, especially in icing procedures on the ATR. So the report, in addition to containing a lot of extremely valuable data about what happened, in my mind, certainly only raises more questions about why it happened. And this is one of those preliminary reports that just as you read through it, you get more and more concerned about what was happening, what was being done to keep this aircraft in a safe condition. And I'm very keen to see the final report when it finally comes out.
Yeah, especially interesting to me is the flight data recorder graph they put out that charts out all of the different warnings, the airspeed, the altitude, the angle of attack, all in one graph. And at the very
Yeah.
end of the flight, you could see that the increased speed warning was on, the degraded performance warning was on, the cruise speed low warning was on, the master warning was on, but they didn't seem to take much action in reaction to that. And at the same time, you can see the readout of the ice detection system is pretty much pegged at the end of the flight, but they didn't turn on the airframe de-icing until towards the end of the flight, until the kind of the last couple minutes or the last seconds, and then they actually turned it off and turned it back on again. And I'm going to be really interested to see in the final report if that's a part of the training. Do you not keep the airframe de-icing system on for too long? I mean, if we're flying a 737, you don't want to keep it on too long because the engine might explode until it's redesigned. But in this case, it was turned off while the ice detection system was still reporting there was ice being detected. So I'm really unclear why the airframe de-icing system would have been turned off. But the graph really spells out a dire situation towards the end of the flight where everything was going wrong, but nothing was being done to prevent a crash here at the end. It's really a confusing read towards the end of it. And getting the final report will be really, really informative, I think, to see what they think happened here. Or was there any sort of procedure they weren't following that maybe was incorrect, or just what happened here? Because the aircraft, in contrast to last week when we talked about the Sukhoi Superjet, automatically basically taking control of the aircraft and ending up in a crash because it wanted to prevent something it perceived as being dangerous. The opposite happened here, where the aircraft was correctly perceiving a dangerous situation but couldn't do anything to actively prevent a crash from happening. Here, unfortunately, a crash did occur, even though the aircraft was doing seemingly everything it could to prevent it from happening.
Yeah, and I think for me, understanding what, and I'm sure the investigators are looking into this because they've said as much at the end of the report, what their future focus is. But what factor did that possible fault in the aircraft de-icing system have on how the aircraft reacted to icing conditions? And then, if there was a fault in the aircraft de-icing system, why did the pilots feel that they could continue flying into icing conditions?
And why did they do so at such a high altitude? I think was also mentioned in the report that what were they at 17,000 feet? I think the report questioned why were they at that altitude? Why wouldn't they try to fly at a lower altitude where the ambient air temperature would be higher?
We will have to wait for the final report.
It's going to take a while. As far as preliminary reports, again, like we discussed last week, this one was extremely in-depth and detailed, which is nice to see.
We now move to the Pacific Northwest, where Boeing and the IAM have a tentative agreement as of right now, when we're recording, Wednesday, September 11th. And the podcast comes out on the 13th of September, and they will either have a ratified agreement and a contract for the next 4 years, and we'll move on from there, or 33,000 of Boeing's machinists in the Pacific Northwest in Washington and Oregon could be on strike.
Oh, that's a big difference.
That's a big difference. So the deal was a big deal in and of itself because the money was on no deal and a strike. The betting man's money amongst analysts was there would be no deal. And I think the average guesstimate of how long a strike would go was 2 to 3 weeks. Well, there was a tentative deal reached between union leadership and Boeing that included a 25% increase in average pay over 4 years, lower medical costs for machinists, increased retirement contributions from Boeing, and reduced mandatory overtime. The big piece that a lot of people also latched onto was a commitment from Boeing to build the next new airplane in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm going to put this in flashing neon. If that project was launched during the life of the contract, which would take us from 2024 to 2028. Previous Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun said that they would be launching the next new airplane when, Jason?
Someday, eventually, maybe, or not.
In the next decade, which would take us beyond the window of this particular contract. So I'm not sure what that means as far as commitments from Boeing, but it's in there. Voting is Thursday, the 12th of September. So yesterday, if you're listening to this, the day the podcast comes out. From what we've seen so far, it looks like next week's episode will be Jason and I talking about how long we think the Boeing machinists are going to be on strike.
Yeah, initial reaction from the union members here doesn't seem entirely positive, though it's hard to gauge these days what's real on social media and what's a Russian bot trying to stir up nonsense. But from the people that we can verify are actually real and actually work for Boeing and actually get a vote, it doesn't seem great so far. But in a letter published to its members on its site, IAM says, "We have achieved everything we could in bargaining short of a strike. We recommend acceptance because we can't guarantee we can achieve more in a strike, but that is your decision to make and is a decision that we will protect and support no matter what." I find that to be an interesting statement saying, hey, this is the best we're going to get, but if you feel like a strike is going to get you more, go for it. Kind of feel like it's going to happen.
The way I feel the wind blowing, I think we're talking about a strike, and we'll know when the podcast comes out this week whether or not we were right. But I think it'd be interesting to note a few things here about what a strike would be or how we would get to a strike and then what could possibly impact that. 2/3 of the machinists union must vote against the deal in order to strike. Otherwise, the deal is approved. So if 65% of the machinists vote to reject the deal still gets approved and the contract comes into force. That's an interesting thing, I think, to keep in mind, even if there are very large number of upset rank and file union members, it might not be enough to go to strike. The other thing that I read today from a Reuters report was that roughly half of union members have fewer than 6 years of experience at Boeing. That's twice the number from pre-pandemic levels. And so I think that's very interesting because a lot of the union efforts were geared towards younger workers, a lot of family policies, and a lot of things that are, kind of focus on long-term employment from a younger workforce, which I thought was very interesting. So younger folks, their impact is going to be felt much more this time around. So it'll be interesting to see on Friday what happens. Or late Thursday, I guess.
No idea how long a potential strike could last. It could be a day, could be a month, could be longer. Nobody knows. But it could very well impact your travel plans. If Boeing's workers go on strike and they can't deliver the aircraft airlines are expecting, maybe that flight you booked this upcoming summer doesn't happen. So you should probably pay attention to this because unexpectedly it could impact you, the airline passenger.
Definitely downline. A strike that could impact you if you're flying to Canada in the next few weeks is Air Canada. Air Canada pilots could be on strike as soon as September 18th. 5,200 pilots, representing pilots that fly for Air Canada proper and Air Canada Rouge, voted to authorize a strike by 98%. 98% of pilots voted and 98% voted yes. Last week, they have until the 15th of September to reach an agreement with Air Canada. It sounds very much like that's not going to happen. After that, it's possible for either side for the union to issue a 72-hour strike notice or the airline to issue a 72-hour lockout notice, that would begin what Air Canada has gone full court press in PR this week as a slow 3-day concerted wind down of its operations. They've come up with a plan because they say we saw what happens when other airlines go on strike and shut down operations immediately. So we've got a plan for a 72-hour wind down, but that could impact almost 3,700 weekly flights across Air Canada's passenger and cargo units. I guess of note, we should say that regional operations for Air Canada, so feeder airlines, would continue to operate, though that's only 20% of Air Canada's operation, and nearly all of those folks end up connecting onto Air Canada Prime flights. So I guess that's not much consolation. But this sounds like it's also heading to a strike here.
Yeah, don't know what the end result will be here, but if reports are right, Air Canada pilots make way less than their American counterparts at Delta American United. So if they think a strike is what it's going to take to get up to par of the other pilots in North America, so be it. Good for them. That's why they have the legal right to strike, and I hope they get what they want, though I hope they can get it without having to go on strike. That would be the best of both worlds, wouldn't it?
It really would. Let's keep everybody moving and in the air. Moving out, Southwest Executive Chairman and former CEO Gary Kelly. After meeting with the folks at Elliott Management last week, Gary Kelly announced that he is resigning as executive chairman of Southwest Airlines effective next year, after next year's board meeting. So in fall of 2025. So he'll be around for a whole nother year. But 6 members of the board of directors are resigning after this November's board meeting. So Elliott sort of gets a little bit of what it wants. 6 of 15 board members are leaving in November. Southwest will appoint 4 new directors, potentially including some of those that have been proposed by Elliott Management. The top line here, though, is that Bob Jordan, who is CEO, gets to keep his job for now.
For now, there is a lot of change coming to Southwest. More change is coming in the next year and a half than has probably ever come to Southwest. Hopefully, it's positive change. Hopefully, it's all change that will be beneficial to the passenger. But man, this is a lot of change real quick.
But is it?
Is it what?
Relatively speaking, is it quick? I mean, relatively speaking, it is quick. But Southwest has moved, I don't know if glacial is the right term, because I've seen glaciers move pretty quick. And I'm pretty sure they beat Southwest to, some of these changes. I'm pretty sure most glaciers have already installed power in their
or extra legroom
seats or whatever.
Yes, but it is a lot of change that Southwest is catching up to the rest of the entire world at this point. I think Elliott, the investment group, does bring a lot of solid points. I don't know if I would agree with the way they're going about making those points, but it has finally lit a fire under the asses of Southwest to do something to compete with the rest of the industry. You can't just rest on your laurels and say, oh, we have, open seating and like peanuts. Okay, great. What else you got?
Got anything else?
It's a lot of change catching up to the rest of the industry very quickly. They're not all that fast, but the amount of change Southwest is doing in this short amount of time is, let's just say, I talked to a few people within Southwest recently, and they're all very busy right now, let's say. They've got a lot of decisions to make. They are all kind of doing the best they can, let's say. But it's a lot of change and a lot of in an unexpectedly short time frame, let's say.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest concerns that I think I have, and maybe Jason you share, is that if there's so much change in such a short window, there's a lot they can probably get wrong. And if they're rushing through this as a way to fend off basically having their executive leadership team kicked out by activist investors, then what happens long term? Because the one thing that Southwest has done well over the years is long-term thinking. And it served them well until it didn't, because they were thinking too long and thinking too far back into the past. And so if you swing that pendulum too far in one direction, what happens then? And, I think one of the other concerns is that as activist investors, Elliott Management is out to make money and get out. Whether or not their ideas are good, whether or not their ideas are, because some of them are, whether or not they come with a slate of board of directors that seems very well equipped to make changes to the airline, which they do. How long will they give the airline to implement those in a way that makes sense for the customer and in a way that makes sense for the people at the airline before they say, we want our money and we're going home?
Yeah, not all changes will be good. Right now, what they're focusing on, I think, is largely good for the passengers, thinking about things like USB ports and extra legroom seating and, oh my God, overnight flights. Can you imagine that? It took until the year 2024 for Southwest to offer overnight flights, which is just kind of wild to think about that I'm pretty sure every other airline in the world offers this, but Southwest didn't offer it until 2024. But longer term, you're right, Ian, it might not all be good for passengers if they play with that bag policy and suddenly 2 bags fly free becomes 1 bag flies free. And then in 2 years from now, it could be no bags fly free. Then what's the benefit of Southwest? Why would I book Southwest? I don't know. So I hope they don't go too far in the direction of more money, more good for Elliott. And then I hope they keep some of what makes Southwest around. Not that I care. I don't fly Southwest, but I know a lot of people do and have a lot of heart for the brand. So hopefully that sticks around.
Fair enough. Where are we going next? We're going to Europe and, well, mostly Europe, but other places too. Because last week we talked about the Cathay Pacific A350-1000 issue in which they had contained in-flight fire and a commanded in-flight shutdown of one of its Trent XWB-97 engines. This was the middle of last week. Late last week, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency issued an emergency airworthiness directive requiring inspections of the fuel manifold main fuel hose on all in-service Rolls-Royce Trent XWB-97 engines. So that is the engine that exclusively powers the Airbus A350-1000 series. Interestingly, there were 3 sets of engines, or 3 criteria timelines for when things needed to be done by: within 3 days, within 7 days, or within 30 days of September 9th was the effective date. So most of the affected engines should be done by the 16th of September. 87 Airbus A350-1000 aircraft in service with 8 airlines around the world. Qatar Airways tops the list at 24. Cathay Pacific and British each have 18. Virgin Atlantic has 12. Etihad and JAL have 5. And Air Caribes has 3. French Bee has 2. So not a huge number of aircraft, and the inspections don't seem to take very long at all. So while they need to get the aircraft on the ground to take a look at them, it doesn't seem like it takes too much time to have a look at the fuel manifold hose and make sure it's where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, at least we know a little more about the situation now, and we now know it's not a widespread issue or something that would end up in the entire A350 fleet grounded. This is going to be a blip in the timeline.
Exactly. Not even too many canceled flights. So that's good. Today, in a joint release, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany said that they are revoking their bilateral air treaties with Iran. So this comes after those countries and the US and the European Union in general say that Iran transferred long-range drones to Russia for use in its war against Ukraine. They said that's a red line we've got as far as additional sanctions, and these additional sanctions include a ban on Iranian flights into the UK, France, and Germany. So that affects Iran Air's flights to London, which are thrice weekly, Paris, which is 2 times a week, and then in Germany, Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt, all at 2 times a week. Iran Air also flies to Italy and Austria. Those flights are not affected as yet, flying to Milan, Rome, and Vienna.
All right. Well, I guess you won't be seeing any Iran aircraft in the UK or France or Germany in the near future. It was always interesting seeing those in Hamburg, the Iran Air A330s, the few that they were able to get a hold of before they suddenly weren't allowed to get a hold of new aircraft again. I enjoyed seeing those, but hey, sanctions are sanctions, so whatever.
That's what they're saying. Nothing has been put in place yet. They haven't said when these will go into effect, as the aircraft are still operating as of today, but we'll see what happens over the next few days or next couple weeks. Jason, I'm all out of Christmas present ideas because my 2.7 tons of cocaine that I had ordered were seized in Guinea-Bissau.
Wow, that's a big order.
I was trying to be generous for Christmas this year, and now I have no more ideas.
Tons. That's like almost 3 times the amount of lead that Swiss is going to have to put on its A330s because it's first class too heavy.
We haven't talked about that, but that's
haven't. I think we just did though.
Oh man. Okay, let's finish talking about my cocaine. Then we can talk about
your confiscated cocaine.
My confiscated cocaine. Yeah. So what happened is a Gulfstream G4 flew from Venezuela to Guinea-Bissau, likely on its way to somewhere in Europe. Authorities have said for years, and I'm saying this all now like I'm an expert in cocaine trafficking, but the things you have to read because airplanes are involved. So authorities believe that Guinea-Bissau has become a hub on the cocaine trafficking route from South and Central America to Europe. And so they got information and intelligence that this particular craft had cocaine on it. And sure enough, 2.7 tons later, they have seized the cocaine and the aircraft.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of cocaine. That's a lot of cocaine. I guess we can go back to talking about Swiss now, because this is one of those things where I feel like somebody should have thought of this, because it's not the first time it's happened.
No, in the long-running saga of how has the Lufthansa Group screwed up the Allegris rollout, which is the rollout of the unified business class seat update for the Lufthansa Group, it was revealed that there's been a bit of a miscalculation for the Swiss A330s, that once they do install this new first-class seating cabin, they will have to counterbalance the aircraft with 1 or 1.5 tons of lead ballast in the aircraft to offset the first class seats being so heavy in the nose of the aircraft versus the lightweight economy seats in the back of the aircraft. It's not super uncommon for aircraft to have to travel with ballast on board, even down to your little regional jets. You'll have to put some sandbags in the back of the aircraft, but to permanently saddle an A330 with 1.5.
It's 1.5.
1.5 tons of lead for every flight for the future of that aircraft. Man, that really flies in the face of everything the airline and the industry tries to say about being eco-conscious and trying to cut emissions. At the same time, they're putting on first-class seats that are so heavy they literally have to fly around with tons of dead weight to counteract it. That's whoops.
Yeah.
And it's just lead. It's not even something fun like cocaine that you could sell with a stopover in Guinea-Bissau.
Well, hold on.
That's some synergy right there.
Now we've got some ideas here. Now we're getting somewhere.
We're going to be on some lists now.
We're already on a variety of lists.
That's true. But cocaine is probably more marketable than lead. But Swiss, in its A330s, will be now carrying around 1.2 tons less lead than cocaine on that one private flight, apparently.
Huh.
Man, that's a lot of cocaine.
It's a lot
tons.
of cocaine.
Jeez.
I know. What else happened this week? Well, as we get to the end of the show, a Beluga XL made its first ever visit to London's Heathrow Airport, carrying a horizontal stabilizer for the British Airways A350, which had been stricken for months because of another taxi incident between the A350 and a Virgin Atlantic aircraft. So they are installing the horizontal stabilizer and getting that aircraft back into service finally. And speaking of finally, SeaTac is back online.
Hey, I hope they can tell everyone what actually happened, because that airport was crippled for weeks. And I guess they said it was a potential cyber attack. And I guess rather than paying a ransom or whatever, they just cobbled back together their systems over a course of like a month. And I think just today they have said, oh yeah, everything's back online. Thanks for your patience. What?
Hopefully we'll know more in the near future because, wow, yeah, weeks.
Yeah, change those default passwords, folks. If your password is password or admin, you're doing it wrong.
It's time to update, yeah. So this weekend is Dorkfest. If you're going to be there, I'm looking forward to seeing you at all of the events on Friday evening, Saturday, and Sunday morning. If you're still around, stop by, say hi. I'll have plenty of Flight Radar 24 goodies. And I've got some fun games we're going to play while we're there. So that'll be hopefully exciting and interesting and rewarding for those that want to play along. And upcoming besides that, well, we'll see what next week brings, considering we thought this was going to be an easy week. I am Ian Petchnick. This has been episode 285 of AvTalk, and I am here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.